All right, we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, again, for joining us for the Shared Micromobility Playbook webinar. My name is Russ Brooks. I am the Director of Smart Cities at Transportation for America, and on the line with us, I have Francie Steffen. Francie is from the city of Santa Monica, and I have Josh Johnson from the Minneapolis Department of Public Works, and they're going to join us and talk a little bit about how they've approached managing and regulating shared micromobility services in their community. But we're going to get started just with a little bit of an overview of the Shared Micromobility Playbook. And what I wanted to do was really just open things up and talk a little bit about why we decided to kick this off. And really, you know, we decided to, out of the Smart City Collaborative, which was our group of 23 cities that came together 4 times a year to work on new mobility issues, policies, and projects. We really, out of that group, candidly, I would say in our work plan for the year, we actually didn't even have scooters on our radar, because when we developed it, scooters really weren't a thing. And I think that speaks to how quickly these services, these vehicles have really entered our communities, and how they've really changed the landscape of how people get around their cities. And so we decided that we wanted to develop the playbook really as a way to help cities understand the policy levers at their disposal as they're thinking about how to regulate and manage these new services in their communities. And what we realized was that there were a lot of cities that were pushing forward wonderfully, developing regulations. I think there was and continues to be some lack of clarity under what are really the options that are available to cities as they think about these different opportunities. So we really wanted to develop this playbook to help cities learn the different sections or areas that they should be thinking about, and really think about how to use those levers to drive the outcomes. And what we really wanted was to figure out how they can best utilize or manage these services in a way that really helps them achieve their outcomes, such as increasing access and safety and economic opportunity, but also as a way to foster things like mode shift and a decrease in congestion and VMT, resulting in lower GHG emissions. So that was really why we started this process, was to really help cities work through that. I think, you know, what we've learned is that, you know, it's been just a little over a year since these services have really come on and entered into our communities, and there's still a lot to learn. And so, you know, we would certainly say that this playbook is the start of an ongoing conversation, and we at T4 have really committed to refining and expanding this playbook as we learn more about the results of these first permit regulations and pilot projects that are going on in cities, and we really learn about the impacts that these services are having, whether they be positive or negative, and we really, as we encourage cities to continually update their regulations as they learn, our goal is to really do the same as well. And so, you know, first, as I had mentioned, we started this process in the Smart Cities Collaborative. So the Smart City Collaborative got together in Pittsburgh. We had 23 cities. We had about 45 different agencies. We had about 70 practitioners and senior leadership from those departments, those agencies, and we sat down and we worked with Lime during that meeting, and we hosted roundtables around each one of the policy sections that I'll get to in a little bit, and really sat down and had a conversation about each one of the policy areas, what were the different possibilities that existed within those policy areas, and how were cities approaching those areas. We also, my colleague Rob Venner and I also did a considerable amount of research back and forth with other cities and cities that had already started regulating these services in their community. And then lastly, I certainly want to raise NACTO. You know, this was always designed to build on their shared active transportation guidelines. Our hope was to use their work as a foundation and expand upon it and continue to grow. It's really important, I think, that we as nonprofits and as advocates in the community really mirror and align ourselves so that we're giving consistent messages to cities and that we're all candidly not recreating the wheel. So I definitely want to call out their work. So as we think about the playbook is divided into 8 policy sections. And these are the policy sections that we sat down in Pittsburgh with our participant cities and reviewed. We both talked about, are these the right 8 policy sections, as well as what are the different areas underneath each that we think are important. And so I will just review them real quick, but general provisions really covers the structures of how the permit is created. Operations is the day-to-day operations of these vehicles and such in the community. Equipment and safety really speaks for itself, so does parking and street design. Equity is a big topic in here, and one that we think these services can really profoundly impact positively. Communications and community engagement, so what are the areas that what areas do we work and effort do we require out of these companies as they come into our communities? How are they communicating their services to users and non-users? How are they engaging communities where they're operating? Data is obviously a large topic, and then lastly, performance metrics and how cities can begin to measure the positive and negative impacts of these services in their communities. And so I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about how we've structured each section so that it makes sense. So we created at the top of each policy area, we created a section called National Standards. These are policies that we think should be in alignment across cities, and that cities should really look to address these similarly. And we also think of these as not necessarily the easy ones, but the ones that we think there either aren't a lot of options or really we should be definitely in alignment among cities. Next, we break it up into sub-policy sections. So underneath operations, for example, we talk about fleet size and we talk about fleet makeup and other topics. So each one of those has an introduction, and so you'll see those. Under each one of those options, you'll see options. So for fleet size, for example, there are 4 options: a small fleet cap, a large fleet cap, a dynamic cap, or no cap. And so as an example, we have a small cap here. We explain the pros and cons with each one of those policy options, and then we provide a case study. So this is an example of a city that has chosen that particular policy option, and then we've created a link back to their specific policy so that you can see firsthand how they've approached it. And then finally, we close out each policy each policy option with a recommendation. And this is our recommendation as we've talked with cities, as we've talked with the industry, and includes some things to think about and our recommendations as an organization on how you should approach each one of these issues. So as I mentioned, that's kind of a rough breakdown in how this resource works. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper here into the operations area just to give you kind of a live fire example of how we've structured it. So under operations, these are the 5 national standards that we think should be in alignment across each city. Cities should develop geographical boundaries for operators and areas that it is clear where these services can operate and where they can't. In Washington, D.C., for example, the district itself is the broad boundary, but within the district, there are areas in which the DDOT here, the District Department of Transportation, has decided they don't want these services to operate. Those are largely the National Mall, the National Park area, and some of those areas where they want to restrict their operations. Other cities have restricted heavy pedestrian areas, such as beachways or promenades or other areas where they want to keep these vehicles from operating. The second is staffing and operations. Cities should require vendors to share company staffing and labor plans. and how they're going to manage their vehicles. And that they should require that these companies have local operation centers to manage customer service and regional operations, and they think it should be in each community. Companies should be required to provide clear contact information for a local manager or operations staff 24 hours a day that can handle cities' requests or other issues or emergencies as they arise. So we are saying that companies should have a physical and personnel presence in each area in which they operate. Cities should require operators to co-create emergency plans and to deal with special situations, whether they be special events like ball games or they be extreme weather events, as we're seeing across the Midwest and the East Coast right now. And lastly, we recommend really that there is some level of policy consistency across jurisdictions. This is really difficult, but one that we think is really important. So customers don't know or always recognize where jurisdictional boundaries begin and end, and it's really important for them to have a consistent user experience, but also to be able to use these vehicles to get from place A to place B. So we absolutely recommend that cities work together with their counties, with their neighboring communities, with other entities in their communities. So those are really the national policy standards that we think of under the topic of operations. We then break it down into policy sections, and I'm going to go through a single policy section here. I mentioned before fleet size, and just to share, this is the introduction, and what we really talk about is that how cities should approach the idea of caps. Why? What is a cap? Why is it important? And what can they really use a cap for as a policy lever as they think about their long-term outcomes. So for cap size, we really, like I said before, we have a small cap, we have a large cap, we have a no cap, and then lastly we have a dynamic cap. And I'll just talk about the dynamic cap a little bit, but basically the idea behind a dynamic cap is that cities can tie the idea of cap size to a set of performance measures which can help incentivize the kind of operations and behaviors that they'd like to see out of the company. So they can have cap size that is tied to equitable distribution. They can have cap size that's tied to what is the makeup of their fleet. Is it scooters? Is it bicycles? Is it e-bikes? Is it adaptive cycles? They can tap it to ridership numbers. They can tie it to other things like simple time-based increases. So once a company proves itself over a certain period of time, that they can increase their operations. I think dynamic caps are really interesting. I think it all depends on performance. It's a really data-driven perspective, but also it lets the cities, or in some cases forces the cities to think about what are the outcomes that they're really hoping to get from these vehicles, from these services, and then be really clear about them and give a set of very clear instructions or guidelines for private sector operators who come into their community. So I think dynamic caps are really the kind of the way of the future, as it were. And so I won't go through all the pros and cons, but you can see that this is a pretty healthy list of pros and cons that come with both. It does take a lot to manage that. It takes a fair amount of effort to make sure that you're really clear about what your goals and your guidelines are. It takes a lot to administer and manage that process and to review the data. But in the long run, this makes sure that vehicles that are out on the streets that are actually being used, it can help mitigate some of the negative potential consequences that come from these services, and it can be really an interesting method of regulation. So, as I said before, we do recommend a dynamic cap size. We actually think that cities should start small and learn how these services operate, begin to get their feet wet, as it were, and learn about the administrative challenges, the data challenges, the operational challenges, the partnership challenges in terms of working closely with the private sector, and then it should be tied to a dynamic cap, but gives them an opportunity both to increase the level of vehicles and devices that they have in a community, but does it in a way that is really tied to the specific performance that cities think are particularly important. So that's just an example. I'm not going to dive too far into fleet size caps, but that's an example really of how we've approached each one of these policy areas. Candidly, there is a lot in there. There's probably about 50 or 60 different policy areas underneath each one of those top 8-line policy areas. It's obviously way too much to go into on a single webinar, but you have an opportunity to really go through all those areas. And as I mentioned, as we continue to move forward, we're really going to try to refine and expand this. We've already started a list of the things that we want to include in the second version that we're going to continue to do research on and really update and expand things. So at this point, I'm really going to turn things over very quickly to Francie Steffen. Francie is the Acting Chief Mobility Officer and the Assistant Director of Planning and Community Development for the City of Santa Monica. And just ask Francie really, which is to share with us her experience and how Santa Monica has really approached regulating and managing these services. Santa Monica really was ground zero for the introduction of scooters in our country, and so I'm really excited to hear from Francie.
Great, thanks, Russ. Appreciate it. Yeah, we were somehow lucky enough to be ground zero, and we started seeing the scooters arrive in September of 2017, first in small amounts and then slowly growing. And in response, it was an environment in which we already had, we have our own local bike share system. It's a system that we as a city chose to own, and then we contract out operations. So we were trying to understand the arrival of this new service, both as a city regulator, but also as a sort of co-operator. And so one of the things we did early on actually was we interviewed about 11 different companies. We thought, well, let's first get our arms around kind of the range of different thoughts of the companies, and that turned out to be a really valuable process. Now, not every city has to redo that process, but I think it sort of speaks to the amount of agency knowledge that's growing over time, and certainly resources like this and NACDO and even NABSA as places where anyone considering these types of programs can go now and sort of ping different questions and get some knowledge back pretty quickly. And we recognized pretty quickly that there were so many unknowns that it's not just that the city didn't know what to do, but the companies also didn't know either, and we were all in a state of kind of co-creation. So we decided to go down the direction of a pilot program because there was just no way for us to develop an ordinance that we could take to council, that we could defend. We didn't have anything on which to base decision making or policy. So we thought, well, let's do the pilot program so that we have the flexibility to not only adapt our own regulatory structure, but also to work really closely with the companies, because it's clear that there are certain things we needed the companies to do and certain things that we could do, and there was no way for the city to do all of those pieces. And as Russ mentioned, we were really interested in the data capture and data side of things, because as an owner-operator of a bike share system, we had the luxury of having the back-end dashboard and knew how much we could get in terms of planning data and utilization data. So that was interesting for us. You can move to the next slide. So we ended up releasing a request for applications, and we got applications from about 13 different companies. Based on that, we did a full selection process with an internal review group, including police department and code enforcement and planning, and ended up picking 4 companies to operate for the period of the scooter program. And Russ, you can turn the slide. If you, oh, you did. There it is. And sorry, you can go back. There we go. So we have the pilot program goes for a little bit more than a year. The idea was that we actually thought we'd have enough data to make some good policy decisions after 9 months, but we also knew that it would take the council and our decision makers some time to actually get to the final rules. So that's why it goes a little bit longer than a year. But we selected 4 companies. We thought, well, each company should be able to get start roughly with the same number of devices. So everybody got 750 devices, but for those that had an interest in operating both scooters and bikes, we split that. So the 2 incumbents that had been operating Bird and Lime got 750 scooters, and then Jump and Lyft shared. Ultimately, Lyft decided that they didn't have the device that they felt comfortable releasing, so they did not release bikes, which I think turned out okay, given that we already had about 500 of our manual pedal bikes here locally. We did end up going with a dynamic cap. That was something that the companies were definitely asking for and that our council was interested in. And I think, as Russ mentioned, it did enable us to start low in the number and gives us some flexibility to go up. Now, as of today, we have not issued any increases in the number of devices, and we can talk about that more later. Some of that has to do with the fact that utilization doesn't hit the threshold. So what we said is once there's a ridership of more than 3 rides per day on a bicycle or 5 rides per day on a scooter, that's the point at which additional devices would be merited. And we haven't issued any increases to date because between the getting the data feeds in order as well as the numbers being fairly low in terms of ridership, nobody has really qualified yet to get that increase. And then as far as the program itself, we felt it was important that the public not bear the cost of this test. So we did set up a cost recovery fee for the staff that operate this program that each operator pays based on a sort of lump sum for the year for being present in the market, and then also per device per year. And that's basically non-refundable. So if the number goes up, the operators pay the per year device and per device yearly cost, and it's non-refundable. And then calculated on a monthly basis, we actually are charging a $1 per device per day sort of use of the public right-of-way, similar to what cities do for outdoor dining. Go on to the next one. So in terms of day-to-day, I mentioned that we knew that we couldn't have all of the rules figured out in an ordinance, and so what we did is we published administrative rules, and all of this is available on our website, by the way, I should say. And the administrative rules have the ability to change over the course of the pilot program, and so it spells out many, many different items that are sort of desired, also many items that are required, and we have the ability to then change that throughout the period of the program as we learn more and we work together with the companies. Certainly all this would not be possible without both a lead within City Hall who is kind of dealing with the communications, who is talking daily with the operators, and also working on some of the internal data structure development, and then a sort of eyes and ears on the street, because you will have people who love the scooters telling you that they're the best thing since sliced bread, and you'll have people who hate the scooters who are telling you that it's the worst thing they've ever seen and the sky is falling. So we needed something in the middle to give us a reality check of what's happening out in the street in terms of compliance with rules and parking behavior. So we do have a roving code enforcement officer who works daily that's paid for by the fees for the program. And last but not least, we certainly, in order to do the dynamic cap, we had to have some sort of real-time data feed, and that's really where we spent the majority of our time in the last couple of months, is trying to get that up and running. But once it is up and running and some of the kinks are ironed out, we really think that's going to be a huge value in the long run, both to the dynamic caps as well as the overall system oversight and management. So lots of decisions to be made. I do recommend that you check out our website, which has the administrative rules on it, as well as some of the history on the ordinance and the selection process and the applications. We did end up posting all of the applications to our website as well, similar to SFMTA. And that's about it for now. I look forward to some Q&A and hearing from the City of Minneapolis.
That's great, Francie. Thank you so much. I definitely have some questions, but I'm going to go over to Josh Johnson real quick, and we'll come back to questions. So Josh Johnson is the mobility manager in the Minneapolis Department of Public Works and has been working on developing the scooter and bike share regulations for the city of Minneapolis. So Josh, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Russ. I do want to give some recognition to T4A, not only for developing this playbook, but actually Russ knows even before we started talking about this in Pittsburgh as part of the Smart Cities Collaborative, the day that BIRD launched in Minneapolis, I was in Seattle for the second in the series of convenings for that collaborative, and went up to Russ and said, who do I talk to about scooters to figure out how do we need to get this regulated, and he was able to point me in the right direction, and I had some face-to-face conversations with folks. So definitely speaking to the value of T4A and bringing a group of cities together last year. So we have kind of a unique approach to bikes and scooters in that in 2018, we established a pilot to allow for the introduction of dockless bikes for our local nonprofit bike share provider, Nice Ride, who had an exclusive agreement, which we extended to dockless bike share for the duration of their previously existing agreement. So they had an agreement running through September of 2021, and we amended that to allow for the introduction of dockless bikes, which were facilitated by Nice Ride going out for RFP and selecting Motivate to introduce and operate both the dockless system and then also assume control over the docked bike system. We also kind of took a unique approach to that in kind of following the lead on Motivate's behalf of establishing kind of a hybrid approach where bikes were to be parked at hubs, and the intention was that the hubs would be some combination of signage and striping, which would allow for kind of the ubiquity that is the benefit of docked bike system without the cost of having the docked bikes or docked associated with it, so that we can kind of realize the benefits of both having some order and organization in the right-of-way, but also introducing a significant amount of bikes in a much larger area. So with that, Nice Ride introduced 1,200 dockless bikes in 2018. That was on top of their existing 1,800 docked bike system. That was began in September of 2018, and then the pilot ended, well, the season ended in November of 2018. Will be relaunched again here likely in April, depending on weather. We also have kind of a unique dynamic in that there were two western suburbs of Minneapolis and also our eastern neighbor, St. Paul, that signed agreements with Lime. So we had two different operators that potentially were crossing over among those three cities, and then also accommodating for a separate pilot at the U of M, University of Minnesota, between Nice Rides and the university. So a lot of moving parts that had to be collaborated among all of those jurisdictions and with Nice Ride and Motivate. Moving into the motorized foot scooter pilot that we established, so actually we anticipated that scooters were going to come. We started building our regulation in April as we started wrapping up the dockless bike amendment, but the timing just wasn't right for us in moving through our council schedule. The day of the public hearing of the ordinance that we established, which required a license to operate a scooter pilot in Minneapolis, BIRD launched that day. As I mentioned, I was in Seattle at the collaborative meeting, and then Lime followed shortly thereafter. So we had to quickly scale up and kind of move up our timeline in terms of introducing that regulation, but also work very closely with both BIRD and Lime to ensure that we took a collaborative approach and not necessarily a reactionary approach in issuing cease and desist and temporary bans. We saw this as an opportunity and used it to shape what we wanted out of the pilot rather than kind of see it as a threat. And so BIRD and Lime operated under kind of the draft rules that we had in place as part of this license agreement while we were working through the council schedule. So the actual pilot launched in August of 2018, ended in November, with the assumption that shortly thereafter, December or January, that there would be likely cold or snow or both that would drastically reduce or hinder the ability to successfully operate this scooter pilot. So from there, we then went to kind of the analysis stage. So I should mention we were able to build dashboards, as Francie mentioned. for both compliance and planning purposes. So compliance, about midway through the pilot, we were able to build some visualizations showing us where scooters were distributed, and actually added bikes as well, overlaid both together to get an understanding of whether or not they were complying with our cap, and then whether or not we needed to determine some different distribution requirements as we move through the pilot. We also started with a small, very small cap number in having 200 for total in the city, and then moving in October to 400 total in the city, so split evenly between Bird and Lime. And then the University of Minnesota launched their own scooter pilot in middle of September with 200 scooters. So as of October of last year, we had 600 scooters total in the city. Russ, next slide. So what we saw, I'll point to the visualizations you see on the right. What we saw with both the bike pilot and the scooter pilot is we have a need for expansion. We really took the approach of making this a limited introduction, not only in terms of the size of the introduction, but also the geographic distribution to get an understanding of what they were, what they meant to people, how they moved throughout the city, and from there use that to kind of craft how we move forward in 2019. On the left, you see Nice Ride's proposed 2018 focus area, and then their 2019 and 2020 follow-up focus areas. As you can see, 2020 gets into covering the entire city. On the right, you see a heat map of where scooters were ridden in Minneapolis, and it actually covers about 87% of city streets, with the red and yellow areas being obviously the most focused. That's generally where the distribution happens of scooters, and then from there we're ridden out throughout the rest of the city. But pretty impressive, as you see, going up all the way north, south, east, and west throughout our city limits. So with what we've learned in 2019, thinking about the bike pilots, Nice Ride is going to be bringing likely a significant introduction of e-bikes into the system. They will be docked, so they're essentially going to be replacing the docked bikes that they currently have, docked pedal bikes with docked e-bikes. And then we're also looking to continued expansion in the service area with a focus on making sure we have equitable distribution and access, thinking about low-income pricing and access programs for those who don't have smartphone or bank accounts. And then also exploring some infrastructure innovation. So Nice Ride has brought to the table some ideas around modular bike racks that they could introduce to go along with this kind of hub model that they've brought to the table, and then also potentially looking at electrifying the docked stations that they're using for e-bikes. So as it exists now, their introduction of e-bikes would only use the docks for the locking mechanism, but they're also exploring the possibility of electrifying those to allow for charging in that introduction of e-bikes. With the scooter pilot, we're kind of moving beyond the stage of really kind of forced understanding or regulation to proactive and ensuring that we're moving beyond just we're trying to introduce this in orderly fashion and to minimize problems, but to really enable good outcomes. And so with that, we're exploring the idea of establishing a goal ratio of people per scooter, and then using that to implement some broader distribution, including some minimum and maximum requirements. So minimum for what we call areas of concentrated poverty or low-income, diverse neighborhoods, and then also maximum requirements for basically what you see in that heat map, areas where they're already performing best, ensuring that we're not overpopulating those areas of scooters. We're also exploring infrastructure build-out in establishing a portion of the fees set aside for essentially advancing our protected bikeway network plan, and then also establishing some dedicated parking zones, and then really using 2019 and beyond to get a better understanding of scooters companies' support operations. So we want to know, what they're doing to test kind of their tech, how accurate they're getting with their GPS, what they're using for potential sensors. I think the scoop may have heard that next generations of scooters may have sensors on it to detect whether or not they're being ridden on a sidewalk, and then displays can read out accordingly, being able to establish maybe some speed restrictions based on geofencing, and then also getting an understanding of how sustainable the support operations are. So are they using things like carbon offset to be able to offset the operations of their employees and contractors who are picking up scooters, relocating them, charging them, et cetera. And then also, getting a better understanding of what their capabilities are for local marketing and outreach, and with those broader distribution requirements, also making sure that they're doing work in those neighborhoods to establish what low-income pricing and access options they have, essentially building out understanding of what scooters are and why they should be using them beyond kind of the early adopters. So that's how we're looking at 2019, really continuing to establish good outcomes and basing them on like shared goals of our Transportation Action Plan, aligning with things like Vision Zero and our Climate Action Plan as well.
All right, thank you, Josh. I really appreciate that. And I think it's important to kind of point out, as Josh did really in the beginning and throughout, that they've had a number of different approaches to different service types and different vehicles. Given the nature of Nice Ride and their bike sharing setup, that has created some complications and some different approaches. And then using that as one strategy with dockless bikes, and then a second strategy for stand-up electric scooters, I think is a really interesting way to see what are the different opportunities and how these different services can be managed, because I don't think anybody else is really doing it that way in the country that I know of. So, as I've said before, Josh, that's a high bar. I am just going to turn things over here to Steve in a minute. We have a number of questions that have come in. We will do our best to work through them, and if we can't get through them all, I will try and write a blog post with a little help, hopefully, from Francie and Josh to answer the questions that we don't get to today. But, as I said in the beginning, this is really just the start of the conversation. This is not the end-all, be-all. There is still so much to learn about what is working and what doesn't work as we think about the policy levers at our disposal as local governments, but also as we see the results of those policy decisions play out in our local communities. And so we're planning to continually update this as we move forward. To aid us in this effort, if you think something is missing, we haven't included something from a policy area, or one of the policy levers we've missed one of the opportunities, please share it with us. If you are a city or a local government who is regulating these and has taken a different approach, please let us know. It is really our goal to be a resource, a place that people, local governments can really come and learn what the options are at their disposal, and then make the decision that they think is best for them and their community. So please, if you have any suggestions or you have any different alternatives, our email address is just smartcities@tforamerica.org. And so I will turn it over to Steve Davis, our Director of Communications, who's going to work through some of the questions that you all have submitted in the chat box.
Great. Thanks, Russ. And thanks, everybody, for your questions. We'll get to a few here today, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up with some other answers. So thank you for taking the time to join us and to submit these thoughtful questions. So I want to start with the kind of general question from Megan Owens, asked early on, Russ. Were these, I assume, sort of the playbook and sort of our big picture buckets that we have up top, were these set up with any particular group in mind? Are they focused on ensuring the best interest of the broad public and of special needs groups?
Yeah, so, as I said just a few minutes ago, I think our number one goal was to make sure that we were just identifying the opportunities for cities, given the nascent state that this industry and these services are, for cities to be able to say, oh, this is something I hadn't thought of, here are the different options that are available to me, and to use that constructively to think about how to apply those different policy decisions to their long-term outcomes and the goals that they want to reach as a city. We did this in concert with cities and with the private sector. We as an organization really have advocated through the Smart City Collaborative and through a number of other projects for cities, but we also need to be cognizant of what's realistic and achievable on the ground by operators and what are the conditions in which their business can both flourish and the cities can also meet their outcomes. So it's our goal to both identify all the different options, but also try to balance the different competing interests here. But candidly, I would say I tend to lean a little bit more than a little bit towards the cities and making sure that we think about the outcomes and the principles as our number one goal.
Great. And a couple questions here that may be directed more to Francie here that I'm going to pair up together from Rachel Grosso and another from Jessica Hirsch-Ballerin. Is constituent resident input considered when you formed your geofenced areas in Santa Monica? And Jessica wanted to know how well did the geofencing technology work, specifically in restricting devices from working in specific areas. So, Francie, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the process of creating the geofence and talk about how well it worked.
Yeah, good questions. So yeah, the constituent and resident input was definitely part of the process, including stakeholders like our downtown business district and some of our parks maintenance folks and parks oversight. During the summer of during last summer and sort of spring, we definitely had a ton of constituent input on the beach bike path, which actually was, really was the big driver about how we're regulating the beach path right now and some of the work that we're doing around education and awareness of what the rules are. So for sure, that was a big part of it. Beach path was one key area. Folks didn't want people riding them inside of the parks. They felt that access to the parks was worth it, but they didn't want them in the parks. So geofencing out the parks was key there. And then also for the downtown, we have a pedestrian promenade. And currently the law says nothing wheeled, essentially, except for a mobility device could be taken there. So we also geofenced that. So those were all key pieces that we got from the public. In terms of how well they're working, I think one of the real big challenges comes in the technology and the sort of choice of GPS accuracy that is coming with a lot of these devices. They tend to be a lower cost GPS device that tends to have lesser accuracy. So one of the things we heard pretty clearly from the very beginning was that the accuracy is quite variable, and that, for example, we couldn't depend upon the GPS devices for regulations for staying off the sidewalks, for example. So I would say in terms of the precision is still something that needs some work. What we ended up doing, however, is a speed reduction, and that seems to work okay because it's a little bit more flexible than an absolute stop on the vehicles or something that disables them. So for example, if you're riding along our beach path and you're in the city of Los Angeles and you get into the city of Santa Monica, what happens is your device slowly slows down until you get to about 5 miles an hour. And that's the speed at which it becomes a little more difficult to balance, and it's not that much fun. And so that tends to deal with people at least getting the picture that something else has happened and they need to pay attention. So for us, I think the sort of saving grace of some of the geofence stuff has been that the way we're using awareness is a little bit more flexible and not needing such a bright line. As far as parking goes, that still is a work in progress, I think, for all of us, is how to use GPS to better regulate the parking and to get that cleaned up on the sidewalks.
That's great. Thank you, Francie. We've got a couple more related questions here that I'm going to group together from Marissa Jones and also from Carl Traxdorf. I want to talk about setting up the fee structure and the cost and what goes into that. Marissa asked, actually I'll start with Carl's question first. Many cities are choosing to require arbitrary licensing fees that appear to have little regard for the actual costs and resourcing impacts of monitoring fleets on the cities. What can be done to ensure these fees are commensurate with the level of resourcing required by cities and not just seen as excessive taxation? And sort of relatedly, Marissa asked a similar question. What is a reasonable cost that cities can expect to spend as a result of allowing dockless vehicles or shared micromobility to operate in their cities, including everything that goes into it? So how do you go through that process of determining the cost structure and relating it to the actual expenses and services that the city is going to have to expend to manage these new services?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it's not impossible to sort of sit down at the beginning and make some best estimates of how much staff it's going to take and what percentage of those people. If you are lucky enough to be able to dedicate people 100%, you can figure in their fully loaded salary for the period of the program. You'll need to make some assumptions about the percentage involvement of other people throughout the organization, including managers, executives, finance people, and that's a kind of local decision of how much of that gets loaded on, or if you have an overhead percentage. But there are some discussions going on the NACDO listserv and NABSA a little bit about how much people are expending in terms of staff time that I think could help those that haven't even started. I can tell you in looking at ours, so that we did develop our fees based on that. Our attorneys here in Santa Monica are very adamant that the fees that we charge for programs be cost recovery. So the way that we developed the fees that I discussed earlier were specifically backed into based on the assumption that we would have 2 full-time people, 1 program administrator, 1 code enforcement officer. Now that ends up being a very low estimate. Because I'm working on it, our city attorney's working on it. A lot of people are working on it that aren't charging. So I think at the end of the day, it's lower than it could be, but that's I think a fair way to at least start the process and leave yourself some flexibility to do a fee update if you need to for the cost recovery. And as far as the public right-of-way fees go, those are not required to be cost recovery, but we did hang our hat on a study that had been done in the prior years for outdoor dining that actually looked at the market rate of a square foot of land in the city. So we tried to key it off something that was real and not just pluck the numbers out of the air.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, feel free to speak to that, Josh. That'd be great.
Yeah, I was just going to add, we had a similar structure in cost recovery and determining, the estimate of oversight of the agreement for 2018 in the pilot. For 2019, I'll just add, we're looking at, in terms of the infrastructure component of our fees, that what we're thinking about is based on what some actual costs are for what we've looked at, both building out curb-protected bike lanes and also potentially bollards and striping, essentially. And then also taking that a step further, looking at adding some stenciling and striping for the build-out of parking zones. And so we're kind of basing it on, a goal of, and this is still to be determined, but using as an example, building out an additional or advancing an additional 10 miles of protected bikeway based on the cost of bollards and striping, and then the associated costs with building out parking zones as well.
Great. There's a few questions kind of grouped together here about infrastructure and about using these services as a way to find ways to incentivize or fund or move the needle on improving infrastructure for shared micromobility. And I have a couple questions here from Gordon Chapin, who wanted to know what has been done in your cities to push for expanded transportation facilities for scooter riders. Have these pilots been accompanied with expanded protected bike lane goals or Vision Zero efforts? And what can we do to improve infrastructure that would improve the experience of riding a scooter? And there's just a couple other questions along with it. Asked about setting up designated parking areas for scooters. And then Marissa wanted to know specifically about the Minneapolis idea of dedicating fees to advance your protected bike infrastructure. So maybe just talk a little bit about how your programs can be used, or you'd like to see them used, or you think they could be used to expand infrastructure for shared micromobility riders that could also benefit people walking or biking.
Josh, you want to jump in first on that one?
Sure, thanks. So just to kind of tee this all up, and I think this is probably a basic understanding of most on the call, but really what we saw through both anecdotal evidence and also through our survey that we established as part of the pilot for scooters specifically was that comfort and safety go hand in hand. And so those who, we had like 75,000 unique users in our pilot last year. A lot of them were new to biking or weren't regular bikers. And so that means they don't have real familiarity with our bike network and likely not a lot of experience riding something in the street that's not a car. And so doing our part to make sure that we're rolling out a program that's enabling good behavior in allowing for the choice to ride on the street in our bike lanes, hopefully in more protected bikeways, and also parking in areas where we'd like them to park rather than in areas where may or may not be the essentially rule of parking in the furnishing zone may or may not be adhered to. So establishing those dedicated parking zones to kind of again encourage good behavior. So what we looked at was, and this isn't necessarily set in stone, but where we can advance our protected bike plan more quickly and use the scooter fees, setting them aside to really facilitate that. And then also we undertook an effort last year separately from the scooter and bike pilots, but definitely related to start inventorying our curb. And so understanding what kind of parking and other curbside uses we have out there, and then really making an effort to understand where we might be able to make some legacy zones that maybe aren't necessarily operationally needed anymore, or take some space that maybe doesn't necessarily make sense in its current use to dedicate to potentially either bike or scooter parking. And then, like I said, going back to encouraging that good behavior rather than penalizing bad behavior. And so that's kind of the approach that we're taking. So it's definitely still in planning stages now. We have fees set aside from last year that we're going to use hopefully to start piloting this year, and then really build into the fee structure for this year going into next year. Like I said, kind of a more planned approach of X miles of potential bike lane build outs and X number of parking spaces as well.
And I'll just piggyback a little bit, which is to say that, I think when this all started going on, I was curious to see how it would change the dialogue around protected facilities and the speed at which we were delivering some new roadway pieces. And it's been less organized than I thought it was going to be. I have to say there isn't a sort of constituency voice that has developed as quickly as I had thought. However, the general populace response to complete streets, I think, is a little bit more open as a result, because it doesn't matter if you ride the scooters a lot or you never ride them, you see them and it's made you aware that there's something new happening. And so I think it's sort of opened up some dialogue and some spaces about how to change the street. So I think that's true. And just specifically around what we've done, we actually took all of the public right-of-way fee and dedicated it to painting lanes green in the city. So we ended up painting about 20 miles of green paint in our existing bike infrastructure just to increase visibility. Was one of the big things we did right away. And we're currently installing a series of in-street and off-street, basically sidewalk, pickup and drop-off zones. We currently have about 27 of them installed in street, like Josh is saying, kind of in areas where they were red curb or other spaces that could be repurposed. We haven't taken out a parking space yet, and we have about 50 that we've put in on the sidewalk. Those are obviously a lot faster and easier because they're being done with just paint. We don't need delineators or anything around the perimeter. But the in-street ones, we did develop a standard plan for the in-street that includes delineators and demarcations for drivers to avoid them.
This is Russ, and I'll just add in from kind of an advocacy side. And Francie, you had mentioned that you haven't seen necessarily an organized response from kind of a single voice, so to speak. And I would say that is similar to what I have seen across the country as well. That I think that largely, we're missing an advocacy opportunity. I think that we have heard a number of people who are existing advocates kind of use this as another example of why we need better infrastructure, why we need more protected facilities. But I haven't seen the kind of coalition of users that I was hoping would spring up as well. And I think the private sector has used their ability to move their audience when it directly benefits them. For example, in DC, when the new regulations were coming out and they were moving from Pilot 1 to Pilot 2, I got a lot of messages from scooter companies saying, call the district, call your councilman. But I haven't seen anything, say, organize and be a really strong partnership between the city and the private sector to put pressure on elected officials to dedicate more space. And I think that we've seen a lot of private sector companies, whether they be in microtransit or whether they be in ride-hailing, turn on their advocacy apparatus when it matters to their daily operations, but we haven't seen it when it comes to protecting infrastructure. And I think there have been some efforts to speak to that need, but I haven't really seen anyone really organize very effectively, because I think we have a whole new constituency here who wants to get rid of the potholes because scooters don't operate well with crumbling infrastructure. That want, there was also a lot of concern about where these vehicles are stored and parked, because there was difficulty in their, as they arrived, before people learned how to park them and where to park them, and we had made decisions about where we want, cities had made decisions about where they want them to go, but there wasn't a mirroring conversation about where they should operate. It was largely a conversation that focused on where they should be stored, and I think that's a necessary conversation, but I think, from an advocacy side, I think we are missing an opportunity to really tap into these hundreds of millions of riders that have rapidly taken to these services and get them to advocate for things that are important to them.
All right, I think we're going to probably wrap it up with this question here. So we'll try to take a sort of big picture view here and hopefully shed some light with some lessons learned by these cities. There's a question from Kathleen Schlesinger who wanted to know, what were some of the unintended consequences or outcomes that occurred, and how were they handled along the way with your project and your pilots? Were these generally issues that stem from the community's perception of micromobility services, or was this grounded in people's experience? So maybe just speak a little bit about some of what you learned over the last year, some of the speed bumps that you hit, and how things were received in the public, what you didn't see coming, and how your cities responded to them.
Well, a lot of it is new, obviously, and we saw some things that aren't super surprising. I mean, we did see, some drop in our ridership of our local, human-powered bike share system. We did see, so it was sort of surprising to see over time that with an education campaign, you could see that there were the regular riders did start to wear helmets and did start to behave slightly differently on the devices themselves. So I think we did actually observe a little bit of a seasonal thing that when we have big influxes of visitors, we tend to see the worst behavior because it's people who are the least knowledgeable about how they run. And we were, pleasantly surprised that some of the outreach and the information about how to ride with a helmet and everything was effective. I think one of the things we're learning a lot about is the sort of differences in the structures of the companies and how the structures, whether they're gig economy or whether they're salaried employees, and the impact that has on their ability to do certain things, and how that affects, even something as odd as how their data is collected. So I think those are some of the areas of learning for us.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking on what Francie just mentioned in terms of data collecting is really understanding what companies are doing. I kind of luck into finding some capacity within our IT staff to build the dashboards that we have, and it was clear that we were figuring this out together with the companies, and that that it was learning on both our parts to make sure we were really understanding what we were getting from the companies. They were understanding what our priorities were and what we were looking for. I will give a shout out to LADOT in developing a mobility data specification, which we've been able to kind of take and run with and even build a little bit in partnership with them and ensure that we have some common language in speaking to both the companies and then also internally as we talk about how best to do this in facilitating the kind of compliance and also planning side of things. One other unintended consequence, actually, it was good and bad in not requiring broad distribution of scooters and not having a large cap number. It was relatively limited to the densest areas of the city, and with that also the trip types were essentially mostly replacements rather than connections. So the good of that was there was a significant amount of both personal vehicle and also TNC and taxi trips that were reported or responded to in our survey as reduced. And then the bad of that was that there also was a reduction in both walking and transit use as well. And so that's kind of informing how we're thinking about 2019 and this broader distribution in kind of reversing that trend and making sure that we're enabling the ability to connect to transit and using combination and multimodal behavior rather than just replacing trips, because obviously the car use and single occupant vehicle trip replacement is definitely a good thing and really helping us to kind of take some overnight action on climate change, but we don't necessarily want to do it at the expense of our transit system as well. So that was both good and bad in learning from 2018.
Well, thank you very much. This is Russ again, and I just wanted to close things out. We've gone a few minutes over time here. I want to say thank you to Josh and Francie for joining us and sharing a little bit of their experience as they've dealt with these new services in their communities. And lastly, I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us for the webinar today. We will be putting a recording of this. We'll send that out to anybody who's registered. We'll also be writing a blog post, as we had said. We've got dozens of questions here that we didn't get to. I will do my best to write them up and try to tap in again to Francie and Josh to add their perspective, and we'll send that out to people who've registered and participated as well. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today.